Welcome to What Matters Worldwide on UCY. We're connecting voices worldwide. I've got my brother joining me back in, and we're going to do about 30 minutes, and we're going to talk about the Ice Age. I had a call, somebody calling me in here, and I didn't answer your call, so we will be taking calls in just a little bit after we get going here when Victor's rolled out, and I will give that call-out number here just in a few shortly. And with that, let me say something else. I really appreciate everybody that's listening, that everybody that's joined the event here, and also on UCY homepage in the chat. Really means a lot. I'm not trying to get my voice out there. I'm trying to get other people's voices out there, and that's my premise of connecting the voices worldwide. So with that, thank you all very much for joining, and welcome Victor Easley, my little brother.
Thank you. I also appreciate everybody that's listening in. I'm not the most gifted speaker in the world, but this is in my heart. It stimulates the mind. It makes sense out of everything we see, and it's a logical explanation. So thanks for listening in, sincerely. We're going to talk about the Ice Age, also known as a Pleistocene or the Quaternary Era. A few quotes to start out. Pleistocene phenomena have produced an absolute riot of theories, ranging from the remotely possible to the mutually contradictory and the palpably inadequate, says J.K. Charlesworth in the Quaternary Era, 1957. If they hadn't actually happened, the Ice Ages would sound like science fiction, says Daniel Pindick, Earth Magazine, June 1996. Although theories abound, no one really knows what causes the Ice Ages, says David Alt, Glacial Lake Missoula and its humongous floods, 2001. So the evolutionists spent decades denying that an Ice Age ever occurred, but there's way too much evidence to deny its existence today. We could tell by scratches on the rocks caused by glaciers moving and retreating over the earth. There's terminal lateral rains as the glaciers push the earth in front of it, kind of like a plow. They're all over the earth, even being formed today on mountain glaciers. There's erratic boulders, which are being transported with scratches on it, sometimes 90 degrees as they turn at the bottom of the glacier. Glacier tills, sometimes many layers, due to the retreat and advance of the glaciers. They can advance 4 miles a year, it's been proven. But to interpret the evidence, the evolutionist has come up with over 60 different theories. Just like in the dinosaurs, how did they die out? And as mentioned earlier in their quote, a lot of these theories will contradict each other. The only thing that they have in common is a disbelief in biblical history. But yet, the biblical model makes perfect sense of what actually happened. And I'm going to try to put that together real quick in about 30 minutes. All the fountains of the great deep were broken up, the windows of heaven were open, and the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. The flood described in Scripture was so massive that the very crust of the earth broke apart. Our planet's original supercontinent broke into several smaller landmasses. These new continents apparently shifted about. Mountains thrust upward. Great cracks extended thousands of miles. Hot magma spewed up through volcanoes and cracks in the ocean. For months, seawater covered the continents and then retreated from the land. These processes produced so much heat that the average ocean temperature climbed to possibly over 100 degrees, warmer than they are today. And it's this warm ocean which set in motion a series of events that would lead to an ice age. Evolution, uniformitarianism have no idea. They just throw in tens of thousands of years. First they said there's 4 ice ages. Now they say there's been over 30 of them. They jump from theory to theory. One thing contradicts it. There is no consistency in the rationale except a disbelief in the biblical history. So the hot ocean water evaporated rapidly, forming intense storms that dropped heavy precipitation on the continents, for hundreds of years after the flood. As the water evaporated, however, the temperature of the oceans cooled. Eventually, it reached the equilibrium we know today, but during the brief period when the oceans were hot, then the cold temperatures and heavy snowfall on continents would eventually produce the Ice Age, beginning in polar regions and then rapidly extended over the continents and on the mountains. Volcanic dust blocked out the sun, kept the continents cold, preserving the ice through the summers. Once the oceans cooled and the volcanoes became less active, however, the clouds thinned, allowing more sun to heat the earth and melt the ice sheets and glaciers. The ice sheets then melted back towards the poles, and glaciers retreated higher up into the mountains. But under the unique post-flood conditions, we had superstorms that developed, which would dump massive amounts of rain and snow at unheard of rates. Probably somewhat similar to the super hurricane, the hypercane we see on Jupiter that's been raging for centuries, known as a Great Red Spot. So superstorms formed under extreme temperature differences present during and following the Genesis flood and would have produced as much precipitation in days as regular storms do in years. So obviously, we don't have uniformitarianism going on. After the flood, you had certain unique conditions that led to the formation of an ice age. And the biblical account of Noah's flood is the only logical explanation that can account for the ice age. So what we needed cooler summers, and we needed a warmer ocean. And we had the cooler summers because we had supervolcanoes going on at that time. You had the ash and the aerosols, which are fine-grained particles jettisoned forth up into the stratosphere. And the stratosphere, they're going to block the sun rays, reflect it off, keep a cooler earth. Mount St. Helens ash plume only reached 25,000 feet as a baby volcano, as 1/2000th the size of the one at Yellowstone. I mean, as a baby. But yet its effects were catastrophic. But we have signs of the Pleistocene volcanicity, and earth movements are visible in all parts of the earth. J.K. Charlesworth says again in the Quaternary era. It's been estimated that 25% of the sedimentary rocks originated by volcanoes, which makes sense. There's colossal evidence of volcanic ash in ice sediments throughout the world, which shows that we had these supervolcanoes going on during the Ice Age. And volcanoes had to keep going to replenish this ash and aerosols in the atmosphere to keep the Ice Age going. According to Michael Ord, who's a meteorologist for 30 years and a creationist, and he has a legitimate model. I'm not getting into it. But he theorizes, according to his model, based upon the cooling of the oceans, and then reaching equilibrium like we have today, that the Ice Age peaked about 500 years after Noah's flood. And that would put it at about 1769 BC. It lasted about 700 years, which would bring it into 1569 BC, which is pretty close to the exodus out of Egypt at the time. Fountains of the Great Deep and volcanism caused a warm ocean, which set in motion a series of events that would lead to an ice age, as I keep saying. If you increase the heat of the oceans, you're going to have more evaporation. More evaporation is going to cause massive snow dumps along the poles. We know that Antarctic was initially free and clear from ice because there are ancient maps. Maps have been copied from another ancient map that shows the outline of Antarctic free of ice. And we didn't even discover that until the 50s with the invention of the sonar. As snow and ice built up, is compacted down, producing the many layers that we have now, it extended the continent out, blurring the outline of the landmass itself, the continental landmass. So this knowledge had to come before it was ever covered in ice, which is consistent with the biblical model. As peak glaciation reached its maximum, a maximum amount of water would have been caught up in the glacier ice. That is why immediately after the flood, you would have less landmass because the waters would have been fairly high. Actually, it's shown that the water levels, sea levels, were 20 feet higher than they are now, based upon ridges, the water level throughout the whole world. That's 20 feet higher than it is now. Then, as we reached peak glaciation, more and more water was caught up. Oceans lowered. At one time, England and France were connected. We had the Bering Strait was below, not covered in water, so that we could have the subsequent migrations from Siberia on over into Alaska and the American Indians. There's actually DNA test and the study of the languages shows that the Native American, North American Indians are different than the Eskimo Inuit, Aleut Indians. So you had to have subsequent migrations. Initially, the American Indian came down, and if they went to South America, I don't know. I wasn't there. Possibly some of them came over in boats. Later, the Eskimos, Inuits came down, and they are the modern Alaskan Indians that we know now. But it makes perfect sense if the water levels were lower. How did the kangaroos get to Australia? Why they hopped? But the water levels were lower at that time, and this is shown by buried cities all over the world. And as we covered last week, the continents rose, the ocean sank forward. And anybody get a Google Earth, and this is amazing. West coast of Africa, you go below the Azores. There's 3 islands, one on top of each other, just on the west side. Magnify it. You see a city 100 miles square, which is 3 miles deep in the ocean at that point. Obviously, the continents, the ocean basin dropped even further. So there's no uniformitarianism. There's no set method. We just know that these events happen. The exact order we don't know, but we're kind of trying to piece together the events. So, as we mentioned, supervolcanoes, fountains of the great deep. I mean, these waters are deep. It's probably hot, kind of like the warm springs we had that warmed the oceans. Warm oceans evaporated more water, made all these massive ice dumps on the poles. As peak glaciation reached its maximum, more water was caught up. There is more land masses, so you have people fanning out, building cities which are now underwater. Krishna had a city off the east coast of India, or west coast of India, which has been recently discovered, even though the fishermen knew it was there for a long time. Japan, I mean, they're all over. But beyond the scope of this program. Thank you very much. But anyway, we can see that an ice age definitely happened. Was there one ice age or was there 30 of them? What makes sense is the biblical model. We had glaciers that covered the Minnesota-Minneapolis area. Summers there are 70 degrees in the summer now. But it's been shown in the Antarctic that you can have a net melt of the glacier ice at temperatures greater than 14 degrees Fahrenheit. That's because most of the melting is from solar radiation. And, of course, the ambient temperature plays a big effect on it. But 14 degrees, you're going to get a net melting. So they had to be very, very cold. But like I said, we had superstorms going on. As the glaciers expanded, reaching their arms out, we'd have these storm tracks along the perimeter of it. And it would cause massive snow dumps to the north on the continent, building up more and more and more. Evolutionists do core samples and say, see, this is proof of hundreds of thousands of years. But they are assuming each layer is one seasonal cycle, a winter and a summer. But there are periods of freezing and cooling, and that was shown in, I think, 1993 or in the 90s. In World War II, there's some bomber airplanes had to sit down. There's 2 of them. They sit down in Greenland. And this guy that collected airplanes restored them, went back to the area. He thought maybe it'd be 30 feet down in ice. But what he discovered, it was actually 275 feet deep in 50 years. and drifted 3 miles from the original landing site. Rebuilt the airplane. They could only get one of them up, and called it Glacier Girl. But we show that we have much more accumulation of ice than we can imagine, and the layers, if you counted, it's not 50 layers that we're counting there. So there are a lot of assumptions, and there's a lot of theories, but they will torture the data as much as they can to make it conform with their theory, which is bankrupt. It really does not hold water. So like I said, we had the Ice Age peak about 500 years after the flood. Temperatures slowly cooled and became to what they are today. The average ocean temperature is like 39.2 degrees. It's shown that just a small increase in temperature can really affect the size of the storms up to 6-fold. We know that in ancient times that the Sahara Desert used to be a lush waterland. There's a big civilization, the stools, petroglyphs, large lake, rhinoceroses, all of this, hippos all lived on there. That's one of the byproducts of the Ice Age was a change of the weather patterns like we witnessed today. We would have a lot of water dumping that made the lakes that we see in the west of the United States where I live. In southern Arizona, there's a huge lake bed. All through Nevada, there's dried lake beds. They used to be filled with water. Pyramid Lake used to be much higher, but it's drying up more and more. Hawthorne Lake, California, there are lakes everywhere. As little as 200 years ago or so, the Indians spotted boats within these dried up lake beds there. But there is more precipitation at that time, plus melted glacier ice, some of the drain off, could have added to building up these lakes. But we know as in recent times. We had, as the glaciers melted, then you'd have huge glacier lakes form. It's only dammed by ice itself. And one of these, Lake Missoula, eventually melted it away and released all of this water, which caused catastrophic erosion in western Washington, the Badlands that we see there today. And that could have caused a lot of the fossils that we see today, too. All fossils are not necessarily from the flood. So, how are we doing on time? So, real quick, we had the large animals at that time. There's a couple of laws, a couple of rules that we note. Cope's rule says that notes that within similar kinds of animals, the fossil species found in the lower layers were often smaller than species found higher up. Since the Ice Age layers are higher up, they often contain larger species. Another rule that's been observed, they don't know why, but this is observed. Bergman's rule states that species tend to be larger in colder climates than similar species of the same genus living in warmer climates. And the reason for that is that the larger they are, there's more surface area, but they have greater volume, so there's going to be less heat loss. We do have natural selection. It is a very legitimate science. Speciation does occur. But what we have to realize, do we have a net increase of information or do we have a net loss of information? The finches on the Galapagos Islands, you had an original finch species blown in from possible hurricane. Different islands had different niches there. Some islands you needed a large beak to be able to eat the seeds. Some of them only a small beak could eat them. Over time, we had speciations among these finches by selectively weeding out from that original parent genetic information to create a new species which is adapted to survive in their environment. If you had a large beak live on an island where you need a small beak, they're going to die out. So you have birds which are born with small beaks, they're going to survive, they're going to live, they're going to produce offspring. But once the large beak genetic possibility is weeded out, then you're never going to reintroduce large beaks again unless you get a large beak comes in there and kind of does a little philandering and stuff. But the point is there is a net loss of information, which is the exact opposite of evolution. That alone disproves evolution. Common sense disproves it. So there was speciation among the saber-toothed tigers. There was speciation among the woolly mammoths. Actually, Louis L'Amour wrote in one of his novels that the American Indians mentioned mammoths as much as like 200-300 years ago. So there was possibly remnants of them that lasted a long time. But what is shown that there's a mass extinction of large animals at the end of the Ice Age because their niche was gone. North America shows a 70% extinction rate. Europe and Asia, 75% extinction rate. Australia, 90%. Africa, almost zero. So they're copacetic. They have a good climate. There's also a megafaunal extinction. But there's one island up in the Arctic that the woolly mammoths, they have their unique environment, and they hung on for a lot longer than the other ones did in general. So you had the glaciers, but there's massive lowlands where they survived and they thrived. These are in Siberia. These are in Alaska, not in areas that an evolutionist model would predict. That shows that it should be covered in the ice. And plus, once it's covered in ice, it's a runaway effect, and it'll be a perpetual ice cap because sun rays will perpetually be reflected back and it would never melt again. So once again, the Ice Age is the only logical explanation for the Ice Age itself there. We did have wet deserts. Like I said, a lot of atmospheric conditions were different. That is why Lot and Noah, which were 1900 BC, where do you want to go? He went in the Dead Sea Valley because it's lush with vegetation. A lot of people say, well, it was irrigated. But we do know if the Sahara Desert in the recent past, 4,000 years ago, was a lush tropical environment, then it makes sense that the Dead Sea area was like that too. Any input that you have, Vincent?
You're doing great. You can find all kinds of remnants, and the flood up in the Scablands up there where the ice dam broke, that modern scientists, about some 100-odd years ago and since had, tried to say that was uniformitarianism, and it's since been found. So just because somebody has credentials and claims to be a scientist, it doesn't necessarily get them credibility of what happens. And like you said, we weren't there. We don't know what happened. We can surmise. We look at the evidence, and some things make better sense. Go ahead and take it back out. I've got an intruder here. I've got a cat broke in on me, and I'm going to unplug here and put him out. And you just keep going, Vic.
Okay. I'm going to sum it up here pretty quick. So how did the mammoths become extinct? Well, like we mentioned, we did have a lot of the glaciers, lakes form. A lot of these dams were breached, caused massive floodings. We see in the tundras of Alaska a sudden catastrophic extinction of the mammoths with buttercups still in their mouth. Babies with their mama on all of that. What caused this? Well, possibly. I mean, they're churned up in sedimentary layer and stuff. So I would think that we had one of these dams burst with freezing cold water, churned up the water, buried them, covered them in the tundra, which is constantly frozen during this time. That's why, there's stories of sled team drivers digging up a mammoth actually eating on mammoth steaks. I don't know if I'd try it, but, who knows? I'm going to Alaska next week for 13 weeks, so if I run across a mammoth, I'll let you guys know. So, that is a very plausible reason why the mammoths were extinct. But, there's remnants of them. But, man, anything that's different that they feel is a threat or they want to hunt or make you manly, you're going to kill it. It's just the way they are. It's a shame that so much evidence is intentionally covered up. So much information has been turned over to the Smithsonian Institution because they're a reputable institute, formed in the early 1800s from donations from the Smithsonian. But ever since Darwinian evolution has become the accepted theory in our government, in our schools. They will do anything in the world to cover this up. That is why the early settlers found all these ancient burials. Inside they have the giants, some of them up to 12 feet tall. Smithsonian Institute shows up. They crate the bones and they're never seen from again. In the early 1900s, there's an article of a cave in the Grand Canyon with Egyptian burials and mummies and hieroglyphs on it. Smithsonian shows up, carts it all away. It's never heard from us again. And it's a travesty. It really is. It's a shame. Because not only does it dumb down people, not only does it insults us. It really does. And if the true history of the earth is really fascinating, and if we had more evidence, we wouldn't have to have so much guesswork and piecing together. But some of the greatest minds in the world have done the research, believe in the biblical account, and they have come up with a very feasible biblical models.
Yes, and Tracy makes a very good point, and I think you covered that. She said, what about the instant temperature drop? And that's how we find these woolly mammoths frozen instantly with Jacks the Buttercups. Won't you fill me up, baby? And yeah, they're frozen in place, and lots of evidence of that, like he's talking about having some mammoth steak. And I remember reading Lee Lamore and the tales of the mammoths at the time. The remnants, of course, with the environment not being conducive to the larger mammals, they were less able to survive, and they were hunted to extinction. Is my summation of that.
A lot of it, yeah, a combination of lots of their niche, a change of environment, and if it's big, then kill it. Just be manly. That's why there's no dinosaurs anymore. There might still be some, like in the Congo jungle, but they obviously survived the flood, because not only are the land mammal created on the sixth day, carried across the ark, I'm not going into that, but where did all of these stories of dinosaurs come from? Where did the Incan burial stones with dinosaurs, the clay figures in Mexico that shows an allosaur with a tail, stuck all the way out, which it wasn't until recently that they saw through a lot of the tuberosities on the bone, oh, hey, this was ligament attachment. Its tail must have been straight out, unless there was an eyewitness account. But what evolutionists do, they'll pay someone off, say, oh, well, I made these myself. Oh, that's the only story that propagates from then on. Okay, it's discredited. Let's move on from there. I mean, it is intellectual dishonesty, and it is not right. It's terrible. It's wrong.
Hey, you know what else? I suppose that you'll have this picture somewhere from Mom's photo albums. But she took a picture up in Dinosaur. This is up where Mike in Salt Lake City, pretty close to where he's at. Dinosaur Monument, or what it was, that park up there. But anyways, it's a petroglyph of a dinosaur on there. And I don't know what's become of that, the picture, nor if that petroglyph still exists. But I think they tried to disclaim it as a forgery or a hoax, But I think it's true.
There's a patina on it so thick that it's really, really hard to image it. It's very, very old.
Do you have that picture Mom took?
Yeah, somewhere. I have her pictures. Plus, I posted on the last week's broadcast the same picture there.
Oh, I must have missed that. I'll have to go back and look. Yeah, we walked with dinos, Jax. Sure enough.
It's kind of like one of the mysteries of science in the Earth Magazine article that I mentioned earlier. But mysteries of science, Ice Age is one of them. They can't explain it. And another one, why is there a male? According to evolution, we should have asexual reproduction. So why are there males in thousands of different species too? I mean, how did we get this evolution to make a male and a female of every species at exactly the right time so that they could breed and propagate their species? How did this happen? I mean, we're talking huge, huge, huge probabilities. I mean, it's impossible. They can't happen. I mean, I live in Vegas. Vegas operates because of laws of probability. Like Equino, a 15 spot has never been hit in the history of gambling, ever. And that's just child's play compared to the odds that we're looking at for evolution to occur.
There's lots and lots of petroglyphs. I've rediscovered many of my own out in the deserts of Nevada. Well, it was really cool. I found some that showed when the conquistadors came through up the Meadow Valley Wash, up by the Fat Notes Ranch up there. And they lived right off below a mesa, but you can hike up the Meadow Valley there, and I found several. There was an old man. He started the museum there in Overton, and he had all kinds of stuff. He had before they flooded and built Lake Mead. I mean, there's a lot of stuff under there. But anyways, I guess we're going to round out here, Vic. And,
all right.
Send me a ticket to Alaska, buddy.
It's going to be different, but it'll be fun.
Uh-huh.
Do the best I can. So.
We've got Ken Putemwup Miller coming up, talking about some fluoride in the water. And you've heard that, don't drink the water. There's a song about it too, I believe. Anyways, thank you, Vic. And I'm going to go over and I'm going to give a little open here and bring in Mr. Miller. And we do thank you, Victor. And I'll talk to you more later.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Aerosols, tiny particles released from flood-associated volcanoes, would have reflected sunlight away from Earth, preventing the snow from melting. Once the aerosols dissipated, enough sunlight would have eventually broke through to warm summers and melt ice. In just hundreds of years, the peak of the Ice Age was here and gone. This cool time period that we call the Ice Age clearly requires hot oceans and volcanic debris, definitely caused by catastrophic events. Secular scientists believe that slow and normal processes, not a global flood, caused many ice ages over eons. But without a worldwide catastrophe, they can't explain the heat and aerosols needed for even one ice age. We can fully trust God's Word, which gives us the clues to explain the recent ice age.
Answers Magazine, Volume 8.2, page 53. What Started the Ice Age? By Larry Vardaman. Transporting enough ice and snow to cover the continents is impossible under current climate conditions. The only viable scientific model would require a unique catastrophe, like the breakup of the Earth's crust during the flood, to energize this ice machine. Geophysicists have a love-hate relationship with the Ice Age, the popular term for a series of ice ages that supposedly struck the Earth every 100,000 years. On one hand, they believe they can prove that small fluctuations in the sun's heating over millions of years coincide with the coming and going of ice ages. Yet they can't figure out how such minor blips in solar heat could cause thick ice sheets to cover half the globe every 100,000 years. They suggest that other factors must be at play. Perhaps minor changes in the distance and angle to the sun work like a pacemaker to regulate the ebb and flow of ice ages. But they can't seem to identify a mechanism that could take such minor variations and amplify them enough to produce an ice age. Perhaps their models didn't work because they didn't begin with the Bible. A catastrophic global flood. Genesis recounts a global, catastrophic event that would have dramatically changed Earth's geology, biology, and climate. Scripture says that all the foundations of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Genesis chapter 7, verses 11 to 12. The flood described in Scripture was so massive that the very crust of the earth broke apart. Our planet's original supercontinent broke into several smaller landmasses. These new continents apparently shifted about, mountains thrust upward, great cracks extended tens of thousands of miles, and hot magma spewed up through volcanoes and cracks into the oceans. For months, seawater covered the continents and then retreated from the land. These processes produced so much heat that the average ocean temperatures climbed to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, or 38 degrees Celsius, much warmer than today. This warm ocean set in motion a series of events that would lead to an ice age. Hot ocean water evaporated rapidly, forming intense storms that dropped heavy precipitation on the continents for hundreds of years after the flood. As the water evaporated, however, the temperature of the ocean cooled. Eventually, it reached the equilibrium we know today. But during the brief period when the oceans were hot, Cold temperatures and heavy snowfall on the continents would eventually produce an ice age, beginning in the polar regions and then rapidly extending over the continents and on the mountains. Volcanic dust blocked out the sun and kept the continents cold, preserving the ice through the summers. Once the oceans cooled and the volcanoes became less active, however, the clouds thinned, allowing more sun to heat the earth and melt the ice sheets and glaciers. The ice sheets then melted back toward the poles, and glaciers retreated higher up the mountains. The ice age caused by the Genesis flood is not a weak, theoretical possibility, but a robust, verifiable event validated by biblical and scientific data. There's no need to postulate a feedback mechanism to amplify minor changes in the sun's heating and angle, as old Earth assumptions require. The high-energy events during the Genesis flood were more than sufficient to cause an ice age. One needs only to recognize that the Bible is a source of historical truth, and that a global, catastrophic, literal flood covered the Earth a few thousand years ago. Recent creationist modeling of storms during the Ice Age. New computer technology allows us to study this marvelous mechanism in greater detail. Under the unique post-flood conditions, superstorms would develop that dumped rain and snow at unheard-of rates, somewhat similar to the superhurricane or hypercane that has raged on Jupiter for centuries, known as the Great Red Spot. Superstorms, formed under extreme temperature differences present during and following the Genesis flood, would have produced as much precipitation in days as regular storms do in years today. Using a high-resolution numerical model developed at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, creationists have recently simulated winter storms, tropical cyclones, and nor'easters thought to have occurred during the Ice Age after the Genesis flood. Each type of storm grew larger and stronger because of the heat released from the ocean. Precipitation increased by a factor of 6 in several different types of winter storms when the ocean temperature was warmed to 113 degrees Fahrenheit, or 45 degrees Celsius. If the precipitation in each snowstorm increased this much, and the total number of snowstorms increased, then glaciers thousands of feet thick would readily develop in only hundreds of years. Other simulations have shown how typhoons, called hurricanes in the Western Hemisphere, would behave in the Arabian Sea near Africa's east coast, and hurricanes off Florida's coast. In both cases, a warm ocean would intensify the storms into massive hypercyclones, greater than Category 5 hurricanes. Light to moderate rain fell over all the modern desert regions of the Middle East. This result supports historical evidence that Israel, the rest of the Middle East, and North Africa were well watered for a brief time following the Genesis flood. The simulated hurricanes off Florida's coast also intensified into hypercanes and changed the direction of storms to better fit the weather patterns that occurred during the Ice Age. 3 nor'easters, storms along the coast of the northeastern United States and Canada, were also simulated under warm ocean conditions. These storms matter because they are necessary to draw moisture from the Atlantic Ocean and form an ice sheet in eastern Canada. In the simulation, all 3 storms grew immensely in vigor, wind speeds increased, and the heavy precipitation fell all over the Northeast in the pattern expected during the Ice Age. The additional snow from nor'easters explains the mountain of snow known as the Laurentide ice sheet of eastern Canada during the Ice Age. Critics have said a single flood-caused ice age is impossible because only multiple ice ages could form the complex deposits we find at the edges of former ice sheets. However, recent simulations of the Des Moines ice lobe show that ice can surge quickly, forming lobes that can move as fast as 4 miles per year and leave complex deposits. Lobes of ice thought to have taken tens of thousands of years to form are now believed to develop in much less time. Consequently, a single, rapid ice age is a likely scenario. Simulations confirm that warm oceans after the Genesis flood caused intense evaporation and snow and ice storms during a single ice age of short duration. If we use God's Word as our starting point, we do not need to rely on unknown mechanisms that require hundreds of thousands of years. In fact, there is no scientific justification for those models. Instead, the Bible gives us the big picture, that helps make sense of our world. Dr. Larry Vardaman is retired professor of atmospheric science for the Institute for Creation Research. He holds a bachelor's degree in physics and meteorology and an MS and PhD in atmospheric science.
Answers Magazine, Volume 8.2, page 46. When Was the Ice Age in Biblical History? By Andrew Snelling and Mike Matthews. The Bible doesn't say, "And then there was an ice age." Yet it does give us the big picture of human history, as well as some critical details, which help us narrow down when the ice built up and then melted away. Just down the road from Cincinnati, in the north-central USA, is Big Bone Lick, the cradle of American paleontology. The discovery of huge bones from mastodons, giant sloths, and other Ice Age creatures sparked the first scientific expedition to collect vertebrate fossils in North America. In 1807, President Thomas Jefferson sent General William Clark, of Lewis and Clark fame, to gather bones and ship them to the White House. Among the treasures Clark found were spear points. After 2 centuries of research, we now have enough information to begin recreating scenes from the rise and fall of the Ice Age. As a massive ice sheet expanded over Canada, it drove out most living things, and then it continued to push south into the Ohio Valley. Eventually, the heavy snows stopped, and the earth warmed. Once the ice began to melt, animals returned to Big Bone Lick, along with spear-wielding humans. Museums worldwide depict similar scenes from this unique era. But it is still difficult to interpret the Earth's dynamic past based on present, slow processes. During the Ice Age, the Earth's landscapes, forests, and grasslands bore little resemblance to our own. Indeed, the thick ice sheets drew so much water out of the ocean that large tracts of ocean floor became dry ground. Herds of animals wandered across a 1,000-mile-wide grassy plain that stretched from Asia across the Bering Strait to North America. And people actually lived in the lowlands between England and Europe. Fishermen in the North Sea sometimes dredge up their stone tools, which look surprisingly similar to those found at Big Bone Lick. Many pieces of the Ice Age puzzle remain unsolved, but one thing is sure. Based on the Bible, we can be certain that the changes occurred within just a few human generations, not over millions of years. What follows is only a benchmark based on our starting parameters. When did the Ice Age begin? The Bible gives us many clues to help us nail down the real time frame of the Ice Age. For example, when did it begin? Bible fact: 8 generations from the flood to Abraham. The Bible gives us an inerrant chronology for marking historical events. It tells exactly how many human generations passed from the flood to Abraham's birth. 8. God's judgment occurred at Babel sometime during the days of Peleg, who was the 4th generation after the flood. Genesis chapter 10, verse 25. The Bible also reveals that humanity stayed at the plains around Babel until the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Genesis chapter 11, verse 9. This means that at least 3 generations passed between the flood and the first appearance of humans in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Meanwhile, the animals on the ark had already fulfilled God's command to abound on the earth and be fruitful and multiply. Genesis chapter 8, verse 17. The Bible also tells us precisely how many years passed from Peleg's birth to Abraham's birth. According to the most often used Hebrew version of the Old Testament, the Masoretic text, the total is 190 years. Each generation lasted about 30 years until Abraham's father, Terah. He waited 70 years to have children, so you could say he waited 2 generations, making a total of either 5 or 6 generations from Babel to Abraham. With this information, can we set an approximate date for the start of the Ice Age? Geological fact: growth of Arctic ice sheets. The Ice Age is an informal expression, so first it is necessary to define the term before discussing its timeline. In secular thinking, the Ice Age does not refer to the first formation of ice on the planet. Indeed, forests grew on Antarctica and the Arctic before ice began to form. Drilling down through Antarctica's ice sheet, scientists have found in sediment layers beneath the ice sheet fossils of a subtropical rainforest, complete with palm trees and macadamia trees. For these to grow, the land would have to be frost-free for a brief time after the flood. As the earth cooled, however, grasslands expanded on the continent, while the forests changed to deciduous trees and tundra. Finally, the whole continent was covered by ice, which marked the beginning of the post-flood cool-down. In the old Earth view, all this took place millions of years before the Ice Age, and without a global flood. The Ice Age actually refers only to the period when great ice sheets arose in the northern hemisphere, well after the Antarctic ice sheet had formed. The deposits from this time period, caused by moving ice and melting waters, are technically known as the Pleistocene. According to old age assumptions about radiometric dating, the deposits were laid between 2.6 million years and 11,700 years ago, 9,700 BC. As the term Ice Age is used in science publications, its end does not refer to the melting of the ice sheets, but to the rising world temperatures that started the dramatic and relentless retreat of the ice. Though this range is clearly not accurate, because it lies outside the Bible's total timeline of 6,000 years, several lines of evidence support the choice of the Pleistocene layers for the Ice Age. Anywhere that these layers have been tested by radiometric dating, the ages fall within this range. Also, the plants and animals associated with these layers fit the Pleistocene. Indeed, the woolly mammoth, Mammuthus primigenius, and the saber-toothed cat, Smilodon fatalis, descendants of the original elephant and cat kinds on the Ark, first occur in these layers and disappear at the end of this time frame, except for a few holdouts on a remote Russian island. Apart from Antarctica and a few high mountain chains, sediments deposited before the Ice Age do not show signs of cold weather environments or ice sheet activity. Indeed, the world appears to have been a pretty balmy place until the Ice Age. Knowing these things, how can we use the human history described in the Bible to shed light on the Ice Age's beginning? Well, for one thing, no human tools or fossils appear anywhere on the earth until found in deposits from the beginning of the Ice Age. God appears to have wiped away all remains of pre-flood man. See Genesis chapter 6, verse 7. Since their earliest remains suddenly appeared throughout the Old World, Asia, Africa, and Europe, it appears that these are the people who scattered from Babel. So it is reasonable to conclude that the start of the Ice Age in the Northern Hemisphere, the Pleistocene, roughly coincides with the Babel judgment around a century or so after the flood, perhaps 2250 BC. Who knows? Perhaps the Ice Age was part of God's plan to keep people from quickly resettling in one place again. The unpredictable climate would have made it difficult for anyone to settle down and raise seasonal crops in the years immediately following Babel's dispersion. When did the Ice Age end? The Bible also sheds light on the Ice Age's end, though in an indirect way. If we can determine the dates of the first cities built after Babel, including Ur, and then show their relationship with dates from the last human and animal remains from the Ice Age, we can establish approximately when the Ice Age ended. Bible fact: Thriving Cities by Abraham's Day. The Bible mentions that some very important cities were established by Abraham's day and continued to thrive throughout Old Testament times. For instance, the city of Abraham's nativity was Ur, Genesis chapter 11, verse 28. Abraham later passed through many other cities in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq and Syria, Canaan, and Egypt. Since Abraham grew up in Ur, we know that it must have been founded before his birth. Another important clue is the Bible's reference to several familiar, domesticated animals, such as camels, oxen, and donkeys, which Abraham and his contemporaries owned. These domestic animals are not the same species as Ice Age fossils of the same created kinds, and they do not appear until cities are well established. The camels found earlier in the fossil record were not anything you would want to ride. It appears that most wild versions of these beasts of burden were extinct by Abraham's time, along with many other Pleistocene mammals, like wild horses in the Americas. Archaeological fact: no cities associated with Ice Age remains. The fossil and archaeological record offers us a phenomenal wealth of data from thousands and thousands of sites on every continent. In case after case, radiocarbon dating confirms a general pattern. While the radiocarbon ages are wrong because they exceed the Bible's timeline, the relative ages are useful. If something dates at 40,000 radiocarbon years and something else at 20,000 or 5,000, we know the first find is older than the second, and so on. Radiocarbon dating shows that every fossil from the Ice Age predates anything from the earliest known human settlements. Several cities have been continuously inhabited since Abraham's day, so it's not likely that we are just missing evidence. Many large mammals, specifically designed for cold weather, went extinct when the Ice Age ended, in a period known as the Ice Age extinction event. We are also able to date human fossils and other remains from the earliest human settlements around the world. In no case do these settlements, including Ur, date as early as the end of the Ice Age. At the time of Ur's settlement, it was a port city on the Persian Gulf. But this gulf did not even exist during the Ice Age. Only later did the melting ice sheets raise the ocean enough to flood into the area and fill the gulf. What were people doing during the Ice Age? Archaeologists have found thousands of campsites and small settlements where Noah's descendants lived after the Babel dispersion during the Ice Age. These early pioneers were daring explorers and settlers, quickly reaching as far as Australia and the Americas. Everywhere they went, they found unfamiliar plants, weather cycles, soils, and wild animals. Cast off from the pampered life of the city, the tiny bands had to invent whole new ways of doing things, including living off the land while caring for their children. Bible fact: the whole earth is settled. The Bible does not reveal much about the biology and geology of the Ice Age, but it does tell us about the languages, culture, and migrations of the people of that time. They began as a united people with one language, capable of accomplishing great feats. Genesis chapter 11, verse 6. But God recognized the danger of unity without obedience to His word, so He scattered the people from Babel. Twice the Bible repeats that the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth. Genesis chapter 11, verses 8 through 9. Notice that this was the Lord's doing. This supernatural event is essential for a proper understanding of human history. Yet without God's written word, archaeologists would have no way of knowing this happened. Archaeological fact: brief appearance of Neanderthals, woolly mammoths, and Stone Age villages. The fossil and archaeological record gives us a wealth of amazing detail about the creatures that Noah's descendants met and the places where they lived. Various species of the saber-toothed cat, such as Smilodon fatalis, began appearing as the Ice Age got underway, though not in the areas first settled by humans. The woolly mammoth, Mammuthus primigenius, did not appear until later, but as the cold increased and grasslands spread across northern Asia and North America, its numbers quickly filled the grassy plains. Humans soon followed in their steps. Another interesting development during the Ice Age was the appearance of Neanderthal people, whose range was restricted to Europe and the Near East. Like all other humans, they were descendants of the people who scattered from Babel. Their remains do not appear until the middle of the Ice Age, and they disappeared as the glaciers reached their maximum and the cold, dry weather reached its worst. Their short, squat bodies were better suited for the cold than the taller, thinner bodies of their contemporaries, the Cro-Magnon people, other descendants of Babel people, who looked like us. The Neanderthals used heavy spears to hunt woodland animals, but these woods began disappearing at the height of the Ice Age, to be replaced by grasslands or barren tundra. The Cro-Magnon, in contrast, made finely crafted arrows and other weapons that enabled them to hunt more easily on the open plains. The vast number of the Cro-Magnon campsites and fossils indicates these men and women were more successful at adapting to the changes. Sometime after the demise of Neanderthal people, the first Stone Age villages began appearing all over the Old World. We find them by the thousands, in some instances spread over several acres and apparently predating any cities we know of. It is hard to imagine such extreme changes in weather, landscapes, and vegetation during the rapid Ice Age and the years that followed. Some lush places in the north were stricken by drought, while monsoons filled the Sahara Desert with lakes and grasslands, attracting rhinoceroses, crocodiles, and human settlers. For a time at the end of the Ice Age, the drenched Nile Valley was not even habitable. At least, no human artifacts or villages have been found from this time. The great cities of Memphis and Luxor did not arise until many years later. Putting it all together. Why did people wait so long after Babel to build cities and farm again? Problems included the tiny populations, the threat of skirmishes, and the changing climates. We also know from the fossil record that they faced constant flooding, dust storms, supervolcanoes, massive earthquakes, meteorites, and downpours of snow or rain on a scale never before seen. It was much safer to live off the land and gather wild grains and game, as people still do in harsh environments. On top of those problems was God's supernatural intervention to scatter the small groups of families over the face of the earth. The very purpose of this judgment, after all, was to limit mankind's ability to do whatever they imagine, and it was clearly successful. Big Bone Lick is a stark reminder of this difficult time in Earth history. The lick was a salt deposit that appeared as the ice sheets began retreating. Animals came to lick the salt and then got trapped in the boggy ground. Humans arrived in the area later, at the end of the Ice Age. Their weapons show up in the fossil record about the same time that the large Ice Age mammals went extinct, around 2100 to 2000 BC. Only later would various cultures begin building pyramid-like mounds and well-defined cities in the Americas, as they did elsewhere in the world. We still have a lot to learn, but we know for certain that the Bible sheds light that puts our world into perspective, including the Ice Age. In fact, it is essential to a right understanding of reality. That extends to modern worries, such as global warming and endangered species, because our understanding of the future is built upon our correct understanding of the past. If mankind would only take God's word to heart, it would transform our thinking in every area and open up amazing new vistas in science and archaeology. Sidebar: Same stone tools, different views. Stone tools and other artifacts from the Ice Age do not come with signs on them telling us their age and significance. Depending on your starting assumptions, you can reach very different conclusions, even if you start with the very same facts. Consider one interesting example. Everywhere we find the earliest known stone tools, in Europe, Asia, and Africa, they have the same basic design, called Acheulean tools. This type of tool appears in most Ice Age layers. Then suddenly, near the end, lots of new styles were adopted, such as the smaller Mousterian blades associated with Neanderthals. If you believe the Ice Age lasted 2.6 million years, then you must assume human beings were making the same basic tools for at least 50,000 generations before any new ideas were invented. That scenario does not quite fit what we know about human ingenuity. God's Word gives us a different picture of human history. The Earth is only 6,000 years old, and humans lived here since the first week. All the Ice Age peoples were descendants of Noah's 3 sons, who already knew how to build ships, towers, and cities. We would expect the people who scattered from Babel to share many of the same technological skills. They also lived longer than we do, sometimes over 4 centuries, so they could pass down technology to many generations. In fact, it is conceivable that most of the stone tool innovations occurred within a single generation. Noah's son Shem was still alive when Abraham was growing up. Sidebar: a different world. When our ancestors scattered from Babel, they encountered a very different world. At the height of the Ice Age, you could walk to England or Japan without a boat. For a brief time, you could even hike overland from Asia to North America. The Persian Gulf didn't even exist. So it's a huge mistake to assume that the pioneers from Babel settled in places where we find people today. The fossil record indicates that this era was rocked by constant flooding, supervolcanoes, massive earthquakes, and super snowstorms. Eventually, things settled down. Many families began raising seasonal crops, and when their populations reached sufficient size, they founded new cities. Coming to America. Today, the Bering Strait separates Russia and America. Travel requires a ship or plane. But during the Ice Age, the ocean was so low that a 1,000-mile-wide grassy plain connected the 2 continents. You could walk across, eating mammoths as you went, and fugitives from Babel actually did. The British Peninsula. Today, the English Channel separates the British Isles from the continent of Europe. But during the Ice Age, Britain was not an island. The ocean was so low that the shallow sea floor was dry land, known as Doggerland. People from Babel actually lived there until the melting ice flooded their homeland. Finding new homes. The Persian Gulf apparently did not exist during the Ice Age. The ocean was so low that coastal waters became dry land. Conditions were harsh, so archaeologists do not find cities from this time. After the ice melted and filled the Gulf, however, people returned to the area and built cities, like a thriving port on the Gulf. Dr. Andrew Snelling holds a Ph.D. in geology from the University of Sydney and has worked as a consultant research geologist in both Australia and America. Author of numerous scientific articles, Dr. Snelling is now Director of Research at Answers in Genesis, USA. Mike Matthews earned a B.A. in English and a M.Ed. in English Education from Bob Jones University. Mike was content manager for the Creation Museum and now is the editor-in-chief of Answers Magazine.